Hi, students. What I wanted to do today was record a couple of lectures during office hours. I'll stop doing this if anybody turns up and has questions in office hours. But for now, I wanted to record a couple of these prezzies to give you a bit more of an idea of what's going on with the slides. So what we're looking at today is really this institution of the Columbian Exchange, which is the exchange between Europe and the Americas, which happens when European people begin arriving in the Americas and interacting with the people who are already living here. A note on language here. European people didn't discover the Americas. There were already people living in the Americas before the Europeans came. They did not civilize the Americas. There were already great civilizations here before people came. They just became aware of them and started interacting with them. So this guy Columbus arrived in the Americas at the end of the 15th century. He brings with him a few soldiers, a handful of plants, and perhaps most consequentially, diseases. Smallpox, the common cold, measles, mumps, and typhus. This is a useful video to watch, which you can watch on your own time. What really gives Columbus a decisive advantage is not his military prowess, but his ability to cause unconsciously biological warfare. So what that means is when he arrives in the Americas, he has been exposed to a number of conditions. Many of those conditions are no longer fatal to people in Europe because they've been exposed to them for generations and they've built up immunity to them, much in the same way that you do when you go and get the flu shot. The people who are living in the Americas have not been exposed to these conditions. And that means that these conditions, which are relatively inconsequential to people in Europe, things like mumps and typhus, they can cause sickness, they can cause death. In the Americas, they cause massive death because people haven't been exposed to them and don't have the antibodies to deal with them. 50 to 90% of indigenous people living in the Americas died. On some islands in the Caribbean, the entire native population is wiped out. Now, the death of these rulers also causes instability. Royal families lose whole lines of people who stand to inherit the throne. This causes people to try and take the throne. There are fewer people to work the fields, so there's famine. Civilization is completely destabilized by the introduction of these diseases. So, for instance, Montezuma, who's defeated by Cortez, is the nephew. So my cat is just sitting on my keyboard. Moosey, no. And the deaths of these rulers causes destabilization, which causes rebellions within the empire. When there are rebellions within these great Latin American, or what at the time are indigenous empires, then the Spanish are able to play one side off against another. So often what they're doing is using the support of one side to get troops or support for their war against a larger, more powerful indigenous empire. But in doing so, they're able to militarily defeat the people who are already living in the Americas, not through any special military prowess, not even particularly because they have this military technology, but this unconscious biological weapon they have, which is their exposure to these diseases. There was one disease that traveled back the other way, and that disease was syphilis. It seems to have come through sailors. That probably came from the Americas. Before European people came to the Americas, many of the animals that we rely upon today, that we relied upon for a long time, didn't exist. The Europeans brought with them things like pigs, cows, horses, and a number of other creatures which not only served as foodstuffs, but also as beasts of burden. That is to say, as animals which can carry things. There weren't that many beasts of burden existing in the Americas before this. People had llamas, but llamas aren't really that useful. They can carry carry about 150 pounds, but you also need to bring food for them. You need to make sure they have enough food and water. So at that point, a lot of what they're carrying is supplies for themselves, and it doesn't really make that much sense. So the animals that existed in the area that were indigenous to the Americas had resisted domestication. Most people who ate meat did it through hunting and gathering, not through farming. The animals that the European people bought were, by definition, domesticated, right? They got them on ships and brought them over to the Americas, and this allowed for a substantial change in diet, right? And we still see this today, this sort of, in certain cultures in Mexico, for instance, there's like a dessert which is the shape of a pig, which shows a reverence for this new and exciting way of eating. Other places, people were, for good reason, petrified. The arrival of horses, for instance, when you've never seen a horse before, it's a huge animal, someone sitting on its back, it seems very intimidating, it seems very scary. Understandably, this sort of gave the Spanish something of an advantage when they first met people. So talking of horses, we have this stereotype of the Native American warrior on horseback, right? This guy. This is something that can only exist after European people bring horses to the Americas, right? Before this, people were much more likely to be hunting and gathering, or even practicing some sort of forest gardening or itinerant agriculture, where they would encourage plants to grow in certain spaces and then travel around all year, going to different places where they had different plants growing. Crops also made this exchange, right? Almost all of the calorie-dense foodstuffs that we rely on in our modern diet come from the Americas. Without some of these things, maize, which makes up a good percentage of our calorie intake today, white potatoes, sweet potatoes, manioc, peanuts, these foods make up a huge percentage of the calories consumed in the world today. It is their import from the Americas to Europe and North Africa that allows the population there to grow significantly. On the other side, we have rice, wheat, barley, oats, rye, turnips, onions, cabbage, lettuce, peaches, things which are a bit less delicious, and sugar. Sugar is crucial. Sugar comes from the Middle East, and it moves to the Americas. Sugar is an incredibly resource-intensive crop, specifically a labor-intensive crop. You need a lot of work to grow sugar. In the tropics, it can grow all the time, but you need a lot of people to keep it growing all the time. Now, the problem with using the people who are already in the tropics, once they've been subdued, is that they tend to die from these diseases that we talked about. And this is where we see the beginnings of what's called the triangle trade. This trade of manufactured goods coming from Europe to Africa, African slaves going from Africa to the Americas, and raw materials coming from the Americas back to Europe. This addiction that we still have for sugar, right, is something that fueled the growth of the slave trade. Without it, we may not have got the plantation agriculture, which required so much human labor input, which required us to enslave people from North Africa, move them across the world. So these New World crops caused the greatest population increase in global history. From 1650 to 1850, the global population doubled. An acre and a half of potatoes could feed an entire family for a year in Ireland. This means you need less land to support the same amount of people. So from 1754 to 1845, Ireland's population doubles because of the introduction of these potatoes. Now, today we associate potatoes with Irishness, right? It's the sort of most, one of the most stereotypical foods you can imagine. But until this time, no one in Ireland had ever seen a potato, right? They were eating things like oats and rye. Manioc, which is like, it's a true yam as opposed to a sweet potato, arrived in Africa and completely changes diets. So much so that some cultures have foundation myths around the manioc. They believe that it sort of gave life to humanity. Corn not only changes the way humans eat, but also the way animals eat, and therefore allows us to have more livestock. More livestock means more protein. So more protein obviously allows people to grow bigger and stronger and healthier. So it's not just a direct change in the produce that people eat. There's also this change in how they are able to grow and eat animals. And now another thing that comes back to the New World is tobacco. Tobacco is this thing that Columbus gets when he trades. He meets some of Columbus's sailors meet these two indigenous people, and they trade them tobacco for these red hats. No one knows what happened to the red hats, but tobacco becomes this scourge of the Western world for centuries afterwards. So here it's this piece written by King James, and they have the date here, 1672, right? King James' Counterblast to Tobacco, to which is added a learned discourse by Dr. Edward Mannering, proving that tobacco is a procuring cause of the scurvy. This isn't true, but they may be associated because long sea journeys would have seen both tobacco and scurvy. A short collection out of Dr. George Thompson's Treatise Against Smoking Tobacco. Also, serious caution against excess in drinking, with many examples of God's severe judgments upon notorious drunkards who have died suddenly. So what this is a very early public health document, right? It's 1672, the King of England telling people not to drink and not to smoke, or at least not to drink and smoke in excess, because doing so is bad for their health, right? So tobacco has been something that people have been worried about for over 350 years, and obviously we still have tobacco, we have different ways of consuming tobacco, but the first time we see it is in this Columbian Exchange. And this little video that you can watch will help you understand that first moment when people from Europe encounter tobacco. The better nutrition allowed the population of Europe to grow. And it is that growing population of Europe which allows the Americas to be repopulated, right? The Americas have been depopulated because of disease, because of the dying out that's associated with the arrival of European people and their novel diseases. And European populations grow because of this new food stuff. So it's the European populations who are able to repopulate the Americas. And this fundamentally changes the genetic and ethnic makeup of the world. We have a group of people now who are largely of European descent, but they're not living in Europe anymore. They're living in the Americas. So this is the beginning of a change in global population. Ever since this time, we've seen an increasing drop in the diversity of both human, animal, and plant life. This is an important note. We often talk about progress in history as if history is a teleological path, as if history is a road that we all walk along that gets us from the past to the present. That is somewhat of a biased perspective. It's seeing the present as the only possible future that was possible in the past, and that's simply not true. There were other futures that were possible. So whilst the indigenous peoples of the Americas didn't have things like monumental architecture in all cases, some did, or gunpowder, they did have flourishing social networks. They did have delicious foodstuffs. They had strongly connected families and social groups. They may have had, in some ways, a happier life than our own today. It's problematic to see the arrival of European people as exclusively progress, right? Instead, we can just see it as change. History doesn't necessarily move forward towards an endpoint, it just moves. Now, what was North America like before the arrival of Columbus? This is a hugely diverse continent, right? Anybody who's been to Canada and Florida, or indeed Canada and San Diego, can tell you how diverse the North American continent is. And this is true of the cultures that were living on this continent as well. It seems that many of the indigenous cultures who are living on this continent, like the Zuni and the Hopi, had already peaked by the time that Columbus arrived, and something could cause their populations to decline. On the west coast, most of these populations made a living by fishing. On the plains, hunting and agriculture, especially after the arrival of the horse, hunting buffalo became a lot easier of a thing to do. Okay, I'm going to continue this in the next video.